I've gotten this one a few times. How could Arnor survive? What if Arnor survived? Can Arnor into space? This is a good question, a much better question than many other what if questions, mostly because it's interesting and I think it can be answered reasonably well. So let's get to it. How could Arnor have survived? And what would have changed if Arnor did survive? The hardest part of what if questions is that you have to alter the timeline. Now, for certain questions, this isn't actually that hard. Take my recent What if Feanor survived video. That was somewhat easy because you can keep everything the same up until the moment of his death, and at that point you alter the timeline. And even when you do alter the timeline, the story doesn't change that much because Feanor is an individual. There's only so much that he can change. And when you explore that timeline further, you realize that events probably would have played out more or less the same. In other words, everything is bad. With Arnor, we're dealing with something much larger. If you want to create a scenario where Arnor survives, you need to find a way to get to that scenario without changing too much. So you can't really just say, okay, yeah, Angmar never existed then. Because then you're not just altering that last 1,000 years of the Third Age, you're altering the whole of the Third Age, in a major way. And at that point, you go from speculation to straight up fan fiction. Which isn't a bad thing, but it's not the purpose of this video. It's a similar scenario if you say, what if Arnor never split? Or what if Arnor won against Angmar in 1409? You're changing so much in the past that it's hard to come up with a reasonable, plausible answer for the future. So we need to find a way to make it so Arnor survives without changing much, and that's difficult, yeah, because Arnor was in deep trouble in the last few centuries of his existence. It was weak, the writing was on the wall, the end was coming, it was just a matter of how soon. So saying, okay, but Arnor suddenly wins, feels kind of cheap, yeah? Because it's a weak answer to how could Arnor survive. Or is it a weak answer? You see, even at the end of its existence, there was a way that Arnor could have survived, a way that Tolkien laid out pretty clearly in his story, a way that was ignored by the characters within the story. It was perhaps one of the most monumental decisions that was made in the Third Age, and if it had gone differently, Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age might have been completely unrecognisable to the way it ended up. We have to go back to the year of 1940 of the Third Age. This was the year that Gondor and Arnor renewed communications after possibly as many as 300 years of silence, and both kingdoms were in bad shape. Arnor was at the end of its strength in its war with Angmar, and Gondor was about to resume hostilities with the powerful Wainrider Easterlings. They reformed their alliance, both sides offering aid to one another if they could spare it, which neither side could, and most importantly of all, Arvedui, the heir to Arnor, wedded Firiel, daughter of King Ondahur of Gondor. At this point, none of this really meant anything. As I said just before, neither Gondor nor Arnor could actually help each other, and Arvedui's wedding to Firiel was sort of just a nice gesture without any real meaning behind it. Or at least, that was what it was supposed to be. In 1944, the disaster at the Morannon occurs, which results in the death of King Ondahur, as well as his two sons, Artemir and Faramir. General Eärnil defeats the Wainriders at the decisive Battle of the Camp, but Gondor now finds itself in something of a succession crisis. There are no close male heirs. Enter stage Arvedui. Upon Ondahur's death, Arvedui attempts to claim the throne of Gondor. His two reasons for this are, A. He is descended from Isildur, who was a joint king of Gondor and was briefly High King of Arnor and Gondor, and B. He is wedded to Firiel, the only surviving child of King Ondahur. His claim is swiftly rejected by the Council of Gondor, led by Steward Pelendur. The crown and royalty of Gondor belong solely to the heirs of Meneldil, son of Anarion, to whom Isildur relinquished this realm. In Gondor, this heritage is reckoned through the sons only, and we have not heard that the law is otherwise in Arnor. Arvedui wasn't going to take no for an answer without a challenge. Elendil had two sons, of whom Isildur was the elder and the heir of his father. We have heard that the name of Elendil stands to this day at the head of the line of the kings of Gondor, since he was accounted the High King of all the lands of the Dunedain. While Elendil still lived, the co-joint rule in the south was committed to his sons. But when Elendil fell, Isildur departed to take up the high kingship of his father, and committed the rule in the south in like manner to the son of his brother. He did not relinquish his royalty in Gondor, nor intend that the realm of Elendil should be divided forever. Moreover, in Numenor of old, the scepter descended to the eldest child of the king, whether man or woman. It is true that the law has not been observed in the lands of exiles ever travelled by war, but such was the law of our people, to which we now refer, seeing that the sons of Ondahur died childless. To this, the Council of Gondor did not reply, and shortly afterwards Eärnil claimed the throne with popular support from the people of Gondor and was crowned as King Eärnil II. Arvedui did not challenge this, having neither the strength nor will, and he stayed in the dying realm of Arnor. The rest is history. In Arnor, the line of kings ended when Angmar overran the kingdom in 1974, and Arvedui drowned the following year, and in Gondor, the line of kings ended when King Arnor, son of Eärnil II, rode to Minas Morgul alone and disappeared. This could have been very different though. 80 years before the death of Ondahur, Arvedui was born to King Arafan, who was advised by Malbeth the Seer, who was gifted with foresight. He spoke these words: "Arvedui you shall call him, for he will be the last in Arthedain. Though a choice will come to the Dunedain, and if they take the one that seems less hopeful, then your son will change his name and become king of a great realm. If not, then much sorrow and many lives of men shall pass, until the Dunedain arise and are united again." The Lords of Gondor took the safe bet, and chose the option that seemed more hopeful. They chose the victorious general beloved by the people over the grim stranger from the Northern Realm, and although neither Eärnil nor Arvedui were to blame, both kingdoms ended up suffering for it. But what if they took that option that seemed less hopeful? What if Arvedui changed his name and became king of a great realm? And in case you're wondering why he would change his name, Arvedui means last king in Sindarin, but for the purpose of this video, he will remain Arvedui. So, the year is 1945. Arvedui, along with his wife Firiel, arrive in Minas Anor, and are crowned king and queen of Gondor. Arvedui would immediately get to work reorganizing and replenishing Gondor's armies, knowing that he cannot delay if he wishes to save Arnor. Speaking of Arnor, it would still be ruled by King Arafant, Arvedui's father, and for the moment the kingdoms would remain separate entities. Unlike Eärnil, Arvedui is well aware of Arnor's dire situation, and would know that he must be proactive rather than reactive against Angmar if he wishes to save the kingdom. Speaking of Eärnil, he would likely retain his role as commander of Gondor's forces. I don't think there would be the threat of civil war, as Eärnil is described as wise and not arrogant, and I don't think he would jeopardize Gondor for his own personal gain. As for his fiery, prideful son, Eärnur, he is still in his teens at this point, so I don't believe he would be an issue either. Under Eärnil, Gondor's forces, supplemented by Northmen from the Vales of Anduin, would march north, probably around the year 1950. There, they would join with Arnor's forces under King Arafant, as well as elves from Lindon and Rivendell. This force would probably be around the same size as the force in the actual timeline. There would be less Gondorians due to marching north in an earlier year, but there would be more Arnorians due to the fact that the kingdom has not been overrun. That army would march north and likely meet Angmar's army somewhere in southern Angmar. I can't see the Witch King remaining behind the walls of Khand Dûm. He didn't stay behind the walls of Fornos, and we know how prideful he can be. Much like the actual timeline, Angmar's army would be swept away, as despite being more powerful than Arnor's army, they aren't overly powerful compared to Gondor. With Angmar's army defeated, the Witch King would flee, Angmar would be destroyed, and Arnor would be saved. Notably, Eärnur, being too young, probably wouldn't confront the Witch King, so we can avoid that entire plot point. With Angmar defeated, the northern kingdom of Arnor would be safe from any threats, at least for the near future. After over 1100 years of warfare, with either fellow successor kingdoms or Angmar, Arnor would finally have peace, and would finally be able to start recovering. Fornost would not be ruined, the Palantiri from Anuminas and Amon Sul would not be lost, along with the countless other heirlooms that went north. Eriador would be far from vibrant, but it would not be the devastated wasteland it was in the actual timeline. So, Arnor survives. Angmar is defeated. What happens next? How do certain future events play out, or do they even play out at all? An interesting event would be King Arafant of Arnor's death, whose historical death was in 1964. Would Arvedui then assume lordship over both realms like Aragorn did? Or would Aranarth, his son, rise to the throne of Arnor as a junior partner, much like Elendil and his sons operated? I'm going to go with the latter. Unlike the situation with Elendil and his sons, there will only be one line of kings involved, based off a graduation system upon the elder's death. Whereas Arnor and Gondor grew apart under the lines of Isildur and Anarion, both kingdoms being ruled by one line, the king and the heir, would not allow this to happen. It would allow effective governance of both kingdoms, further helped by the ability to communicate through the Palantir. It would also give the heir the experience of ruling the lesser kingdom before eventually moving on to ruling the greater kingdom. It's also possible that Arvedui might rule both kingdoms at once, like Aragorn ruled the reunited kingdom. But I think the problem with this is that the realms are too large and the distance involved is too great. And when Aragorn ruled the reunited kingdom, the Arnor part of the kingdom was, well, barely a kingdom. It wouldn't have required a whole lot of governance. Only a few years later we have the fall of Minas Ithil, which historically occurs in 2000 to 2002. I'm torn on this one, but I ultimately believe that the city would probably still fall. If a proactive military-minded leader such as Eärnil could not stop the city from falling, then I don't necessarily think that Arvedui could have stopped it either. I think the survival of Arnor would have little impact on what happens to Minas Ithil, and if anything, it might bring the fall of the city forward a few years. I think Minas Ithil's fate was sealed when the Great Plague ended the Watch on Mordor. However, as I said earlier, the whole Eärnur Witch King rivalry would never end up happening, and I don't think a similar event would occur between Arvedui and the Witch King, due to how different Arvedui and Eärnur were from each other. And it goes without saying, the House of Stewards would never come to rule Gondor. Arvedui would rule until his death, which would probably be around 2030, and Aranarth, probably also using a new name now, would come to rule Gondor. His son, Arahale, or the equivalent of, would then become King of Arnor. We can then start skipping forward in time. The Watchful Peace would probably still occur, and during this time, Arnor would slowly recover its strength. Instead of the decay of civilization in Eriador, civilization would slowly begin to expand once again. Farmland would be reclaimed, new towns would be founded or restored, and the roads would be repaired and maintained again, especially those leading south towards Gondor. Trade would flow between the two realms, and as Arnor's influence creeps south once again, so would Gondor's influence once again creep northwards. Farbad would become an important town, providing the land link between the North and South Kingdoms, much like it did many years ago. At this point, events become a little hard to gauge due to how much Middle-earth would change. The wars in the south would eventually resume, but this would little affect Arnor far to the north. This would allow the kingdom a measure of safety, and once their strength was sufficiently recovered, they would be able to send forces to aid Gondor in the south. This might affect the founding of Rohan, as Gondor might not need to call upon the Aethiod to fight against the Balcloth. Assuming events do happen as they did, I think it would still be in the strategic interest of the King of Gondor to grant Calenardon to the Aethiod, given the fact that the land was heavily depopulated following the Great Plague. Although this would mean Gondor and Arnor would no longer share a proper land border, it would make the journey less treacherous by having a strong, allied nation peopling the lands of Calenardon and maintaining roads and rest stops. As to what happens during the War of the Ring, who can guess? Certainly the lands of Eriador would be far less perilous, and if Bilbo and later Frodo's journeys were to occur, they would often be travelling through populated lands rather than deserted wilderness. If Aragorn were to live, he would not live as a grim ranger, but as a king or prince of Arnor. The Shire would not be an isolated land protected by a few hardy rangers, it would exist as the heartland of a peaceful, prospering realm protected by strong armies. Instead of the Grey Company marching south to aid Aragorn, it would be Arnor's army under the command of Arnor's king. And who would call upon the Oathbreakers? Well, Isildur would have many heirs running around, it could be any of them. There would be no return of the king, because the king never left, and because the king never left, Gondor and Arnor would be stronger for it. I think the War of the Ring would be very different, and we can speculate all we want in the comment section, because I've done all I can. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you are interested in more videos about Arnor, one of my earlier videos was an in-depth on why Arnor was weaker than Gondor, but beware, the video uses the legendary toaster microphone. If you have more what-if scenarios you'd like me to look at, post suggestions in the comments, but please don't suggest stuff like, what if Melkor never turned evil? I really don't want to be touching shit like that. Thanks, farewell, and remember, always choose the option that seems less hopeful. That way, you'll never be disappointed.